Picture this. You wake up, you check your phone out of habit before you even sit up in bed, and the first headline you see says, "The United States has officially slipped into its second Great Depression." Not a recession. Not a correction. A depression. The kind of word that used to belong only to black and white photographs of breadlines and shuttered banks, and now it is sitting right there in your notifications next to a weather update and a text from your mom. Meet Sarah, a 38-year-old graphic designer living just outside Phoenix, Arizona. She has spent 12 years building a career, first at an agency, then freelancing, then finally landing a stable in-house design job at a mid-sized marketing firm that handles branding for regional retailers. She owns a modest 3-bedroom house with her husband. She has a decent balance in her retirement account, and she believes, the way most people believe, that if you work hard and stay reliable, the system eventually rewards you. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, her manager calls an all-hands meeting. The company has decided to restructure the entire creative department because a new AI-powered design platform can now produce ad campaigns, social content, and brand assets in a fraction of the time it used to take a human team. And the leadership has decided that keeping 20 designers on payroll no longer makes financial sense when 3 can supervise the machines. Sarah is one of 17 people let go that day. She is handed a severance folder and a box for her desk plants, and she walks out into the Phoenix heat, feeling like the ground has quietly shifted under her without warning. At first, she's not panicked. She has savings, she has experience, she has a portfolio. She assumes this will take a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at most. But as she starts applying, she notices something unsettling. Every job posting for a mid-level designer now lists AI tool proficiency as a requirement, not a nice to have, and many of the roles she used to qualify for have simply vanished from the listings altogether, replaced by fewer, more senior positions overseeing automated systems instead of creating from scratch. She is not imagining this. Across the country, technology firms alone shed tens of thousands of jobs in just the opening months of the year, with a growing share of those layoffs explicitly tied to artificial intelligence adoption. And economists have started describing the labor market using a new phrase, a jobless boom, where corporate output and profits keep climbing while hiring quietly stalls. Because companies can now do more with fewer people. Executives at consulting firms, banks, and retailers are openly telling shareholders that automation lets them shrink teams without shrinking revenue. And entry-level and back-office roles are disappearing first, because those are the easiest tasks for a machine to learn. Sarah is far from alone in feeling this shift, but knowing that does not pay her mortgage. Meanwhile, the broader economy is already wobbling before her layoff even happens, because for months the news has been full of warnings that most people scrolled past without much thought. The national debt has climbed past $38 trillion, an amount so large it barely means anything until you learn that the interest payments alone on that debt are on track to double within the next decade, eating up a larger and larger share of everything the government collects in taxes, leaving less room to respond if things get worse. Consumer confidence has been sliding for months in a row. Credit card delinquencies are creeping upward, and the personal savings rate, the cushion families rely on when a paycheck disappears, has fallen to levels not seen since before the pandemic. Layered on top of all this is a wave of tariffs that reshaped global trade almost overnight, pushing the average tax on imported goods to levels the country has not experienced in generations, driving up prices on everything from electronics to groceries, and adding roughly $1,000 a year in extra costs for the average American household. Businesses that rely on imported materials or parts are absorbing what they can and passing the rest along to customers. The manufacturers who were promised a boom from reshoring are instead facing slower investment because nobody can predict what the trade rules will look like 6 months from now. It is the kind of uncertainty that makes companies freeze instead of expand. Then, almost like a spark meeting dry grass, a handful of over-leveraged banks that had been quietly exposed to a shaky corner of the market start to wobble. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Depositors start pulling money out just in case, and within days what should have been a contained problem turns into a full-blown crisis of confidence. Stock markets, which had already been jittery for months, drop sharply and keep dropping, wiping out a huge share of the value that had built up over years in a matter of weeks. It looks eerily familiar to anyone who has studied 1929, when a stock market crash triggered a wave of panic selling, when banks that had overextended themselves through risky lending collapsed one after another, when the money supply shrank and credit simply stopped flowing, and when a wave of new tariffs, back then called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, choked off international trade, made a bad situation catastrophic. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes closely enough to feel unsettling. Back in Phoenix, Sarah watches her retirement account lose a third of its value in a single month. Her husband, who works in construction, starts hearing that developers are pausing new residential projects because banks have become far more cautious about lending, and buyers have become far more cautious about spending. Within weeks, his company lays off half its crew, him included. Now 2 incomes have become 0, and the mortgage does not care about any of it. They start doing the math late at night at the kitchen table, the kind of math nobody wants to do. Stretching the emergency fund they were once proud of, canceling subscriptions, switching to store-brand groceries, delaying the dentist appointment they both need. They are not unique. Across the country, the same scene is playing out in millions of kitchens. Because when consumer spending pulls back everywhere at once, retailers see fewer customers. Restaurants see empty tables, and small businesses, the ones that make up the backbone of nearly every local economy, start closing their doors at a pace nobody has seen in years. Every closure means more layoffs, and every layoff means less spending, and the cycle feeds itself the way a fire spreads once it catches wind. Factories that build cars, appliances, and electronics slow their production lines because fewer people are buying big-ticket items when they are worried about their next paycheck. Shipping ports see fewer containers moving. Freight companies lay off drivers. Housing prices, which had already been strained by an affordability crisis for years, start sliding as sellers outnumber buyers, and mortgage rates stay stubbornly high, leaving families like Sarah's watching the equity in their home shrink at the exact moment they need it most. Young people trying to enter the workforce for the first time face a brutal reality, competing for a shrinking number of entry-level roles against experienced workers who have been laid off and are willing to take a pay cut just to have income again. Cities and states, whose budgets depend heavily on tax revenue from income, sales, and property, start feeling the squeeze too, delaying road repairs, freezing hiring for teachers and public workers, trimming services right when demand for those services is rising fastest. And because the American economy is so deeply woven into the rest of the world, the slowdown does not stay contained within the country's borders. Countries that export heavily to the United States see their own factories slow down. Global trade volumes shrink. Currencies swing wildly as investors scramble for safety, piling into gold, into government bonds, into anything that feels solid in a moment that feels anything but solid. Central banks around the world start cutting interest rates in an attempt to keep credit flowing, but rate cuts take time to work their way through an economy, and in the short term, uncertainty dominates almost every decision being made in every boardroom on the planet. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to stop and simply sit in the fear of it, because there is a lot to be afraid of. Sarah and her husband are afraid. They lie awake wondering if they will lose the house, wondering how long unemployment benefits will stretch, wondering what happens if both of them are still out of work in 6 more months. But if there is one thing that history keeps proving, decade after decade, crisis after crisis, it is that human beings and human economies do not simply collapse and stay collapsed. They adapt, often in ways nobody could have predicted at the darkest point of the downturn. During the depths of the crisis, entrepreneurs who have been quietly building side skills start launching low-cost businesses that meet the exact needs of a squeezed economy, repair services instead of replacement purchases, budget meal kits instead of restaurant dinners, resale, and consignment platforms that let families turn unused belongings into fast cash. Sarah's neighbor, a former restaurant manager, starts a small meal prep service out of her home kitchen for families who still want a decent dinner without the cost of eating out. And within months, she has more orders than she can handle alone. Freelance platforms see a surge of new sellers offering everything from resume writing to home repairs, people patching together income from multiple smaller streams, because one steady paycheck no longer feels like something to count on. At the same time, even in the middle of an AI-driven wave of layoffs, new categories of work are opening up that did not exist a few years earlier. Roles overseeing automated systems, roles training and auditing AI tools, roles in the clean energy sector that keeps expanding even when other parts of the economy contract, because demand for electricity from data centers and manufacturing keeps rising no matter what the stock market is doing. Solar installers, wind technicians, and grid engineers are in short supply even during the downturn, with industry groups warning that the country needs tens of thousands more trained workers in these fields than it currently has, which means for someone willing to retrain, there is an actual door opening even while other doors are slamming shut. Sarah eventually enrolls in a short certification program for a role that blends her design background with user experience work for renewable energy companies, building out consumer-facing apps for home solar systems, a field that barely existed when she started her career, and one that keeps hiring, because the underlying demand for energy infrastructure does not disappear just because the broader economy is struggling. Meanwhile, policymakers, having studied the mistakes of the 1930s for nearly a century, do not simply stand by and watch the spiral continue. Interest rates get cut aggressively to make borrowing cheaper and encourage banks to lend again. Emergency programs get rolled out to stabilize the banks that are still solvent but frightened, preventing the kind of chain reaction bank run that wiped out thousands of institutions back in the original Great Depression. Extended unemployment support gets approved to keep basic spending alive in households that would otherwise cut off nearly everything. because economists on every side of the political spectrum understand that when millions of people stop spending on food, rent, and utilities all at once, the downturn only gets worse. Infrastructure spending gets accelerated, putting people back to work, rebuilding roads, bridges, and power grids, echoing the public works programs of the original New Deal nearly a century earlier, when a similar collapse led to jobs programs that literally rebuilt large parts of the country's physical backbone while putting cash back into the hands of families who desperately needed it. None of this fixes everything overnight. Recovery from a depression is not a light switch. It is a slow climb, and it takes years rather than months for confidence to fully return. But slowly, month after difficult month, the data starts to shift. Consumer confidence stops falling and starts to level off. Credit becomes slightly easier to access as banks regain their footing. Manufacturers who had frozen investment start cautiously restarting projects that had been shelved. Companies that survive the worst of it, leaner and more careful, begin hiring again, even if slowly, even if warily. Sarah gets a call nearly 8 months after her layoff, offering her the renewable energy design role she trained for. It pays slightly less than her old job at first, but it comes with something her old job never fully had, a sense that the industry itself is expanding rather than contracting, which, after the year she has just lived through, feels more valuable than almost anything else. Her husband picks up steady work again as construction slowly resumes, this time on projects tied to grid modernization and battery storage facilities being built across the state, an entire category of construction work that barely existed a decade earlier and now cannot find enough skilled workers fast enough. Looking back on the year that took nearly everything from them, Sarah does not romanticize it. She does not pretend the fear was not real, or that the stress did not change something in her permanently, the way a near miss on the highway leaves you checking your mirrors more carefully for the rest of your life. But she also recognizes something that the history books tend to gloss over in favor of dramatic photographs of soup lines and stock tickers crashing to zero, which is that every major economic collapse in modern history has eventually given way to a period of rebuilding, and that rebuilding almost always ends up reshaping the economy into something different from what came before it. The Great Depression of the 1930s, brutal and devastating as it was, ultimately gave rise to a completely new financial regulatory system, deposit insurance that protects everyday savers to this day, and a wave of infrastructure that still underpins parts of the country nearly 100 years later. The Great Recession of the late 2000s, painful as it was for an entire generation of workers and homeowners, eventually gave way to one of the longest periods of economic expansion the country has ever recorded. Nobody living through a downturn in real time gets the comfort of knowing exactly when the turning point will arrive, and that uncertainty is genuinely one of the hardest parts of living through one. But the pattern across a century of American economic history is remarkably consistent. Decline, panic, painful adjustment, policy response, slow stabilization, and eventually a recovery that often looks nothing like the economy that existed before the crisis began. If a second Great Depression really did arrive tomorrow, the honest, unflinching truth is that it would be brutal for millions of families. Unemployment would climb to levels that feel almost unimaginable from where things stand today. Businesses both small and enormous would fail. Home values and retirement accounts would take a beating that could take years to fully recover from. And the emotional toll on people who lose their sense of stability and identity tied to their work would be real and significant, and not something to minimize with easy optimism. But the equally honest, equally important truth is that depressions, no matter how deep, have never in modern history been permanent. They end, sometimes slower than anyone wants, sometimes at a cost that reshapes entire industries and communities. But they end, and what comes after tends to include innovations, industries, and opportunities that simply did not exist before the crisis forced people, companies, and governments to adapt. For Sarah, that adaptation meant walking away from a career path she thought was permanent and finding an entirely new one inside an industry she had barely considered a year earlier. For the country as a whole, if history is any real guide, it would mean a painful, multi-year stretch of hardship followed by a restructuring of finance, labor, and technology that eventually produces a stronger, if very different, foundation. The lesson underneath all of it is not that downturns do not matter, or that the pain is not real, because it absolutely is real for the people living through it in real time. The lesson is that resilience, both individual and collective, tends to be underestimated in the middle of a crisis, and only becomes obvious in hindsight, once families like Sarah's have rebuilt, once new industries have absorbed workers displaced from old ones, once policymakers have adjusted the rules to try to prevent the exact same mistakes from happening again. Nobody can predict with certainty whether the country is actually headed toward a second Great Depression, and reasonable economists disagree sharply on how likely that outcome really is, with some pointing to the mounting debt, the AI-driven labor disruption, and the trade war's serious warning signs, and others pointing out that the labor market, while cooling, has not collapsed, that inflation, while elevated, has not spiraled, and that the economy has so far avoided the kind of full-blown banking crisis that turned past downturns into full depressions. What is certain is that building a financial cushion before trouble arrives, staying adaptable in your skills and your income streams, and understanding that even the worst downturns in history eventually gave way to recovery are lessons worth carrying regardless of which direction the economy ultimately goes from here. To really understand why so many analysts keep circling back to the 1929 comparison, it helps to look at what actually happened underneath the surface back then, because the surface story everyone knows, the crash on Wall Street, is really only the trigger, not the full explanation. Throughout the 1920s, an entire generation of investors had been buying stocks on margin, meaning they were putting down a small fraction of the actual price and borrowing the rest, betting that share prices would simply keep climbing forever the way they had for most of the decade. When prices finally turned in October of 1929, first slipping, then falling hard on what became known as Black Thursday, those margin loans turned into a chain reaction of forced selling because brokers demanded their money back, and investors had no choice but to dump shares at any price just to cover what they owed. Between the market's peak and its low point over the following weeks, prices fell by roughly a third, and by the time the bottom was finally reached a few years later, publicly traded companies had lost close to 90% of their combined value. That alone would have been a bad recession. What turned it into a full-blown depression was what happened next in the banking system. Thousands of banks across the country, many of them small local institutions that had made risky loans during the boom years, simply ran out of cash as frightened depositors rushed to pull their savings out all at once. More than 9,000 banks failed over the course of the crisis, wiping out the life savings of millions of ordinary families who had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong institution. And because the Federal Reserve at the time was slow and hesitant to step in and support the banking system, the money supply itself shrank dramatically, which meant credit for businesses and families simply dried up almost overnight. On top of the crash and the bank failures came a policy decision that historians still point to as one of the greatest economic mistakes of the century, a sweeping new tariff law that raised import taxes to some of the highest levels the country had ever seen, meant to protect American industry, but instead triggering retaliation from trading partners around the world, and international trade collapsed by more than half within a few years. Farmers, who were already struggling with falling crop prices, were hit with a devastating drought across the central plains that turned once fertile farmland into what became known as the Dust Bowl, forcing hundreds of thousands of families to abandon their land entirely and migrate in search of any work they could find. Layer all of that together, the crash, the bank runs, the collapse in trade, the environmental disaster, and unemployment climbed past 25% nationally, with some cities seeing even higher rates. And it took nearly a full decade, and ultimately the mobilization for a world war, before the economy truly returned to full strength. The reason economists and financial commentators keep drawing uneasy parallels to today is not because they think history will repeat itself exactly, history rarely does, but because several of the underlying ingredients feel uncomfortably familiar, even if the specific mechanics look different. Instead of margin loans fueling a stock bubble, some analysts now point to the enormous sums being poured into artificial intelligence infrastructure by a small handful of technology giants, with combined spending commitments running into the hundreds of billions of dollars in a single year, funded partly through debt and partly by eating into cash reserves at a pace that has some investors quietly asking whether the returns will ever materialize fast enough to justify it. If that spending were to slow suddenly, either because the technology fails to deliver the productivity gains companies are promising, or because financing simply becomes too expensive, the ripple effects across markets that have become increasingly concentrated in a small number of massive technology stocks could be significant, since so much of the broader stock market's recent gains have been carried by so few companies. Instead of thousands of small local banks collapsing from bad real estate loans the way they did in the 1930s, today's concern tends to center on less regulated corners of the financial system, private credit funds, highly leveraged trading firms, and institutions with exposure to commercial real estate that has lost significant value as remote and hybrid work reshaped how much office space companies actually need. Instead of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the country has lived through its own dramatic reshaping of trade policy over the past 2 years, with average tariff rates climbing to levels not seen in more than a century, adding real costs to household budgets and forcing manufacturers to rethink supply chains they had spent decades building, all while trading partners consider and, in some cases, implement their own retaliatory measures. And instead of a stock market crash serving as the obvious spark, some economists worry the actual trigger this time could be something quieter and slower moving, a labor market that keeps softening beneath a surface that still looks calm, growth in output and profits that no longer translates into growth in hiring because artificial intelligence lets companies produce more with fewer people, until enough households simultaneously pull back on spending that the slowdown becomes self-reinforcing in exactly the way it did back in the 1930s, just through a different door. None of this is meant to say a depression is guaranteed, and it is worth being honest that most professional forecasters, even the ones sounding alarms, still consider a full depression on the scale of the 1930s to be a low probability outcome rather than the most likely path, with many expecting, if anything, a moderate slowdown rather than a catastrophic collapse. But understanding why the comparison keeps coming up, and understanding which of today's warning signs most closely echo the mistakes of a century ago, matters because it points directly at what individuals and families can actually do to protect themselves, regardless of which scenario ultimately unfolds. Building an emergency fund that covers at least 3 to 6 months of essential expenses, rather than assuming a steady paycheck will always be there, turns out to be one of the single most protective financial habits a person can build, because it buys time. And time is exactly what families like Sarah's did not have enough of in the early weeks after a sudden layoff. Paying down high interest debt before a downturn hits matters enormously too, because credit that feels manageable during good times can become suffocating the moment income drops, and interest keeps compounding regardless of circumstances. Diversifying income, even in a small way, whether through a side skill, a freelance project, or simply staying connected to a professional network outside your current employer, turns out to matter just as much as diversifying a stock portfolio. Because in a downturn driven partly by automation, the workers who adapt fastest tend to be the ones who already had a foothold somewhere else before they needed it. And perhaps most importantly, staying informed without spiraling into panic, understanding the difference between normal economic ups and downs and a genuine structural crisis, helps people make calm, deliberate decisions instead of reactive ones driven by fear, which history shows again and again tend to be the decisions people regret most once the dust finally settles. Sarah still keeps a framed photo on her new desk from the week she got laid off, not because she wants to relive it, but because it reminds her of something she did not fully believe until she lived through it herself, which is that the version of her life on the other side of a crisis can end up looking completely different from the one she was planning for, and not always in a worse way. Her husband jokes that they should frame the layoff notice next to it, and she always says no, but she keeps both memories close anyway, because together they tell the fuller story better than either one alone ever could. Whatever comes next for the broader economy, whether the warning signs flashing across markets and headlines right now fade into just another difficult but temporary slowdown, or whether they build into something closer to the history books, the pattern underneath every single American economic crisis for more than a century has stayed remarkably consistent. Painful contraction followed eventually by adaptation, restructuring, and a recovery that reshapes who and what the economy actually runs on. That pattern will not make the hard months easier to live through while they are happening, and it should not be used as an excuse to dismiss real warning signs or avoid real preparation, but it is worth holding on to anyway, because it is the single most reliable thing history has taught about downturns of every size, that they end, that people rebuild, and that the industries and opportunities waiting on the other side are very often ones nobody saw coming until they were already standing inside them.